I'm Kimberly Foyle, a genetic counselor with the CF team at the Medical University of South Carolina. And I have no disclosures. The CF Foundation's Education Committee is a multidisciplinary group of adult and pediatric specialists. Our term on the committee is 3 years, and the application process is based on experience with CF, experience creating and reviewing educational materials, and our ideas for the development of CF education. The next round of applications will be shared by email and through the my.cff listservs in the spring of 2024. Here's a list of current members with a photo of the committee from last year's meeting at NACFC. Prior to last year, there was not a position for a genetic counselor on the Education Committee, but a call opened for a genetic counselor member in 2022, and it's been terrific to bring the perspective of a genetic counselor to the committee over the past year. The CF Foundation Education Committee reviews educational materials submitted for approval. Materials are vetted for accuracy, applicability for centers across the country, and must meet a recommended reading level of about 8th grade. Materials in the resources guide are routinely reviewed to ensure that they are still available. These materials include educational resources approved since 2022, including an updated CF-related diabetes manual, Beacon Learning CF Patient Education Quiz, and CF Rise CFTR Modulators Answer Guide. Resources approved by the Education Committee are available in the MyCFF Resource Library. The 2023 edition of the CF Education Resources Guide has been shared on MyCFF via the listservs and can also be downloaded from the Resources Library. If you're unsure of how to find a resource or if a certain type of resource exists, try looking on cff.org or on my.cff.org in the resource library. If you're looking for a resource in print, you can email resources@cff.org or check out the Clinical Educational Materials Order Form on my.cff.org. The My.CFF platform is different than PortCF. My.CFF is where your center fills out its annual review form, maintains care team information, and orders educational materials, among other things. This is the same site where the CF Exchange forums, also known as the listservs, are hosted. To access My.CFF, go to my.cff.org and log in. On your dashboard, click the Order Forms tile where you will see the Clinical Education Materials Order Form. This platform enables you to see all educational materials that are available to order in hard copy. And as you can see here on the left-hand side, the order form has educational materials organized by topic. We additionally encourage you to be involved by submitting educational abstracts for NACFC, responding to needs assessment surveys, notifying the Education Committee about resources that are out of date or unavailable, distributing education to the CF community, and submitting new resources for the Education Committee to review. Please reach out if you have any questions. Thank you and enjoy your day.
See if it shows up.
How about on the...
There we go. All right. So thank you everybody for joining this morning. I can really just see a big black screen, but I assume you're back there. So I'm a little short for this setup, I guess. This is the disciplinary group for genetics and genetic counselors. And our title this year is Advocating for Patients with Rare CFTR Variants and what we can do right now. So what kind of tools do we have at our disposal? The two chairs for this session are myself, Becky Dara, and Eleanor, who you spoke with a minute ago. We have nothing to disclose related to this presentation, although we both have active grant funding as listed below. So our agenda today is a little bit about announcements. We've already heard from the CFF Education Committee. Then we have 3 different speakers, and then we'll have some time at the end for questions and discussion. So first, the announcements. I'd like to draw everybody's attention to the fact that for those of you who are members of the CFSIG, or for those of you who would like to consider being members of the CFSIG, we will have a get-together tomorrow morning for some breakfast foods and coffee. Around 7:45 to meet at Press Coffee Roasters, which is on Van Buren Street right next to the convention center here. So come join us, and we can chat a little bit about the SIG and what kinds of things we're doing. There are also Category 2 CEUs available for this meeting for genetic counselors. Keep track of the sessions that you're attending. You can actually fill out the forms in sort of real time after each session on the app. So you can fill out the evaluation forms. So you have to do that, and then a full program evaluation in order to submit for Category 2 CEUs. Here are some sessions that we'd like to highlight. These may be of interest to you as genetic counselors. Whoops, I went a little fast. I'm not going to go through each of them, but take a peek and see if any of these might catch your interest. So here are the ones for today. A couple this morning, a roundtable for lunch, or I'm sorry, that's not a roundtable. Rapid poster session. Thank you very much. And then, of course, the plenary later today. Tomorrow, there are a few things going on that may catch your eye. And then Saturday, newborn screening series. And here are some posters. Here are some that are about theratyping, sort of clinical population genetics kinds of topics. Maybe you've already seen many of these have already been on your radar, but in case they aren't, these are some that you might want to check out. Sexual and reproductive health is a huge topic this year, which is really exciting to see that getting even more traction. Very important for our conversations with patients especially. Newborn screening, diagnosis, and equity. There, if anybody's interested. And then finally, we'll start with our program this morning. We have a few learning objectives for each speaker. So our first speaker will be Dr. Megan McGarry, and the learning objective for her portion of the talk will be to relate health disparities in CF screening, diagnosis, and treatment to morbidity and mortality outcomes. Next, we'll hear from Dr. John Brewington, and he will explain the goals and methodology of CF theratyping to identify potentially eligible candidates for modulator treatment. And finally, Dr. Megan Januska will talk about alternative routes to improving equity and access to CFTR modulators, including theratyping and select case study reviews. All right, so with that, I'm hoping maybe somebody from back there can help launch the next series. Do you know how to do that?
Takes a village.
Yes, it does.
Be you. Okay. This should advance your slides. Okay. And if that doesn't work for some reason,
I'll just do this.
Yep, you do that, and the pointer. You can use the pointer.
I won't use the pointer. We're
Okay.
good.
All good.
All right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Dr. Megan McGarry. I'm a pediatric pulmonologist at the University of California, San Francisco. And I just thank everybody for being here so early in the morning, joining us for breakfast. And I have no disclosures for this presentation. So cystic fibrosis occurs in all races and ethnicities, and it occurs across the world in every population. And here in the United States, our CF population has really become much more diverse over time. So you can see back in 1987 that the light blue is Hispanic, the yellow is Black, green is multiracial, and purple is Asian, and then a darker blue is other. So you can see that that proportion of the population has really increased from about 8% to now about 18% in 2022, and keeps growing. But if you look at the pediatric population, it's even more diverse. So now you can see that the under 18 years old, it's almost a quarter of the CF population is a race or ethnicity other than non-Hispanic white. So if you think about our babies that are coming through the newborn screen, we expect that that population is actually much more diverse than even this 25%. And we expect this to continue. So the CF population is becoming more diverse in part of detection through newborn screen and awareness, but also because the United States is becoming more and more diverse. So the chart on the left is showing over a 5-year period where immigration, where people immigrated from into North America. And you can see from around the world, all different areas. And then the chart on the right is a chart that matches how diverse is the population and how quickly are they becoming more diverse. So white, which you don't see here at all, is an area that's not diverse and not becoming diverse. The yellow is areas that are less diverse, but the most quickly becoming diverse. And then the dark blue is areas that are very diverse, but also quickly becoming more diverse. So you see overall that your population is changing. And so anything that you knew about your population from 5 years ago is already, incorrect. And this is really important because CFTR variant frequency distribution in your population is really dependent on where someone's family came from. So their ancestry admixture, where people either migrated from or were enslaved from. And because of this, CFTR variant frequency varies by race and ethnicity. Although they're not uniform amongst a race or ethnicity, particularly the Hispanic population. And what you can see is that when you're looking at the CFTR variant mutation classes, that the light blue is class 1 to 3, which are the classic severe. You can see like 3/4 of your non-Hispanic white population has one of these variants. But when you look at the purple, which means that they're unclassified, so that's variants that are known but not yet described and what that variant does, you can see it's 27% of people who are Black have a variant that is like that, 23% Hispanics, 20% of other multiracial people with CF. And then the most interesting, which I pose to you all, is the people who are not fully genotyped. So that's the orange. And this is all from the registry back in 2020. So while only 3% of people who are non-Hispanic white are not fully genotyped, it's about 9 to 10% of people who are Black, Hispanic, or other races do not have 2 variants identified. And so you can see that it's just very different, and there's a lot of need in this area. Now, this is an interesting paper that is now getting a little bit old, but very interesting. They went through what are the top 50 variants in people with CF who are either white only, Hispanic only, Black only, or Asian only. And then this is the list of the top 10. And what they looked at is to see what variants were unique in the top 50 only to that race or that ethnicity. And so you can see that in the top 10 for people who are non-Hispanic white, none of their variants were unique to just their population, but 2 variants in Hispanics were, and then 3 variants in the top 10 for people who are Asian were unique to only people who were Asian. And what's really interesting is when you look at the top 50, so 4 of the 50 variants were unique only to people who were white, but 20 out of 50 were unique to people who were Hispanics. That means 40% of the variants were only seen in people who are Hispanic. So 14 out of 50 were only seen in people who are Black, and 18 out of 50 were only seen in people who are Asian. And so I think this is important to remember, even though variants may be rare overall to a race or ethnicity, they may actually be common. And so when we're thinking about like, well, what variants are we testing for? What variants are on newborn screenings or panels, we need to remember that we need to be thinking about who these people are and what their genetic background might be. Now, when Newborn Screen First was developed, it was really thought that this was going to be something that was going to be equitable, that they would have increase in equity. When this CDC report first came out, the reason that there's babies of multi-races and ethnicities on here, because they really thought that this is going to be a great equalizer in the CF. And unfortunately, what we've seen that it's been the exact opposite, that it's really been something that drives disparities and has not benefited all populations equally. And So we did this work looking to see, well, gosh, who's being missed by newborn screen, who's having delayed diagnosis, just using the registry. So what we did is the first column, for those in the back, is the CF population that were born since 2007 to 2020. So since newborn screening was universal across the United States. And then what we did is the second column is anybody who was reported as a false negative newborn screen in the registry. And then the third column are those that their diagnosis was after 180 days, so quite a delayed diagnosis. And what we see is when we compare the proportion of the population is that although the population, only 3.6% are Black, and the overall population born during that time, they were 6.5% of the false negatives and 6.5% of the delayed diagnoses. And then you look at people who are Hispanic, so 8.6% of the population, but 15.5% of the false negative newborn screens, and then a whopping 23% of those who are delayed diagnosis. And then I think my squares are off a little bit. So then the next one below that is the mixed race. And you can see that it's 2.4% of the population, but 5 and then 5.7% of the false negative and delayed diagnosis. And you can see that the non-Hispanic white are much less represented in the false negative and the delayed diagnosis. And so you can see that it's a real problem right now. And it's a real problem for states that are more diverse as well. So what we wanted to do, we wanted to see, well, gosh, how do variant panels actually work in the actual CF population? And so what we did is we took the CF registry, for better or for worse, and we looked at all the variants, and then we modeled by race and ethnicity how these panels would work. And the full paper models both detection of 1 and 2 variants with these, but for this, we're going to report just the 1 variant because that is at least what you need to have a positive newborn screen in pretty much every state. And so when you look overall, so the ACMG panel, it looks great, detects 93% of the total population, at least 1 variant. That looks like a really great test. But for people who are Asian, it detects only 56%. So it's almost half of the kids, if you use this, would have no variants detected, and you would have a false negative newborn screen. So this next group, sorry, my colors are off on this. So this is the African American and Black population. So once again, it's only detecting 3/4. So 25% of your Black babies are going to get missed on this newborn screen, 0 variants detected. When you look at, so this is Hispanic, American Indian, Alaska Native, and people who are multiracial, it still is about 80 to 85%. So you're still missing a big proportion of your populations. And then you can see it's actually like 95% of the non-Hispanic white population. Ignore the Native Hawaiian population. There's only 9 kids in the registry who are Native Hawaiian, and they all have Delta 508. So we don't actually know really what this population has, because there's not a CF center in Hawaii. If anybody wants to help me with that, that's my other pet project. Let's get Hawaii going. So then we modeled the Illumina 139 panel, because that's a huge jump. Illumina 139, that's a lot more variants than most states were testing for. Only a slight bump when you look overall. But now you're detecting almost 3/4 of people who are Asian for at least 1 variant. So still missing a quarter, but much better than before. Detecting about 83% of people who are African American, so also a big bump. Now you're into the 90% detection zone, and then a much higher. So bumping up to the 139, you really do detect a lot more. But also remember, this is still just the 1 variant. It's the graph looks really horrible still for detecting 2, but at least you have 1. Now, we modeled off the CFTR2 database to say, gosh, if we had every variant in the CFTR2 database, and this was back in the 402, not the most recent change, you don't see very much change in the overall population. It's still 95% overall for the population. But now you're detecting slightly more for people who are Asian, but you would still miss about a quarter. Up to 84% for people African American, Black, much higher, and then much higher overall. And so I think this just really shows that we still don't know enough about variants that in people who are Asian and people who are African American Black in order to put them on these variant panels. And we need a lot more research in this area, a lot more case reports, a lot more basic science research to really be able to like fully understand what these variants are. So we then moved on to, we then took census data and we took these detection rates and we modeled it with the latest census data to figure out, well, how would they work in each state? So with the ACMG panel, so this is all the states, we ranked them from worst to best. And you can see that the states on the left are that the tests do worsen are the states that are the most diverse. So Hawaii does the worst, Puerto Rico, California, DC, Maryland, Texas, Georgia. And then states that these do better overall are states like Montana, Maine, West Virginia. And so when we model it for California, if we had used this test, we'd have an estimated 18% false negative rate, which is just unacceptable. So then this is the modeling with Illumina 139. So you can see overall it does better, but you still have states that it would a failing score. In California, you would still be missing 11% of your babies. And then when we move up to the CFTR2, with the 402 variant panel, California moves up to a 9% false negative rate. You can see Hawaii and DC and Maryland still really do poorly. And this is really where you go into the percentage of your population that is Asian or Black. And so it shows us that we do need to add variants, but maybe we need to add variants in a different way. And I really want to redo this with the latest CFTR2 database to see. So we've been doing work in California. So this is work that's not yet published, but is on the verge of being submitted. And California has always had sort of their unique thing they've done. We originally started with a 39 variant panel, and that's what the dark blue is. And our public health department did a really good job of tracking all the missed cases. So we have a database of all the missed cases and getting really detailed information about what their mutations were and a description of them. And then going through series of quality improvement programs, adding variants to our detection panel. So through this process, we went from 39 variants to now 75 variants as our initial panel that we screen for, and really paying attention to when variants are occurring in more than one and more missed baby. And so with that, with the yellow, so for us, you can see that the second column for people who are Asian, we still missed 1 out of 5. So we still had a 20% false negative rate. But for people who are Hispanic, we are detecting almost everybody. So it's about a 98% detection rate for people who are Hispanic. We then modeled, what would it look like if we moved the CFTR2 database just based on our actual just kids in our newborn screen, and you can see that it does really improve it. We would detect 100% of babies who are Black in our state that we know about. So obviously all of these, there are probably still some kids who are out there that haven't been yet diagnosed, but much, much higher. And so we are working to try and see if we can increase the number of variants in our state. So then we looked at, what's the odds of having a false negative newborn screen in California by race and ethnicity? And through just moving to the 72 variants, and this is actual data, not modeling hypotheticals, only people who are Asian had a higher rate or higher risk of having a false negative newborn screen. Everybody else, we've been able to make it fairly equitable. So how does newborn screening contribute to disparities? I think we can all sort of say, we know that it must be harder to be diagnosed, but there's recent, CF Foundation has done lots of listening events with families, particularly families of people who are Black or Hispanic whose kids were missed on newborn screening. And I just wanted to pull out some of the quotes because I think there are so many barriers to be diagnosed when your newborn screen is normal, quote normal, and that actually for these families, it creates more of a barrier to be diagnosed. So this is a long way. So they went to their pediatric office. This is a mom whose older son has CF. So they went to it and He printed off and signed it and said, you have a normal newborn screen. You need to be really happy. So she starts crying. She says, symptoms are exactly like his brother's. He's very salty. I lick him. It's awful. And the doctor says, you are being paranoid that you have another child with CF. So she went to her the post-op appointment with OB, told the OB-GYN her concerns. She said, newborn screen is accurate. You need to believe what you were told, that this is normal. And then she said she laughed at them because they licked their baby, and she said she'd never heard them licking a baby, and hysterically cried laughing. Finally, their pediatrician said, fine, I'll order a sweat test because you need to stop about this. The sweat test was positive, baby diagnosed 4 months after birth with CF. So she wrote, my baby and family suffered tremendously during these 4 months, and she will cry every time she talks about this. So here's another one. My child did newborn screening. What they found, they blamed on me, my breastfeeding. So if your doctor is telling you don't worry about it, I'm not going to worry about it. But then the child's dehydrated and showing all the symptoms, and she goes, I don't know how we rewire that. There is a bias against these families for being diagnosed after a normal newborn screen. This one, both my carrier screen and Roland's newborn screen only tested for the more common mutations. Neither of his mutations were on either mutation panel that was tested for. We took numerous trips to the ER, doctor's office before being diagnosed with CF. We struggled watching our baby's health decline in front of us and constantly being sick. They were accused of not feeding him or caring for him properly. We often hear stories of people getting CPS called on them because they're not feeding their children. And then we have to be at the brink of death before being diagnosed because of the persistent stereotype of it being a Caucasian disease. So I think it's so important that we fix newborn screening because these families face so many more barriers to try and get diagnosed. And we also need to do so much more education with everybody in the healthcare system that a normal newborn screen does not mean that they don't have CF. So, and this is so important because health outcomes in people who are Hispanic and Black are much worse. So people who are Hispanic have much lower lung function. And on the West Coast here, it's twice as bad as every place else. And this is controlling for all the things that we've learned that contribute to lung disease. 9 percentage points difference in FEV1 here on the West Coast. And we don't know why. Increased risk of infections. They're at higher risk for Pseudomonas, higher risk for Mucoid-Pseudomonas, higher risk of staph infections. And not only that, they get it at a younger age. So not only at an increased risk, getting a higher age, worse lung function, hard to get diagnosed. And now we've done even more with that was all pre-modulator data. They don't qualify for modulators. So even though modulators are 92, 93% of the population, you can see, so this is for people who are Black, only 2/3 qualify for Trikafta. For people who are Hispanic, it's about 2/3, and people who are other races, Asian or multiracial, it's about a little bit over 70%. So these patients, we really need to work on getting their diagnosis correct because they're facing so many challenges after that this is the place that we need to really be able to care for these families. And I think also that we really need to work because it breaks relationships. I have moms that are their kids are, double digits. They're in their teenager years, and they will still come and talk about their delayed diagnosis and cry. And I think that it causes so much trauma that we don't really talk about. And really, all people with CF deserve to experience health equity. And what that means is that we can't just have it, they go to childhood, and then as an adult that they're sick and they're on disability and they're suffering and they have an early death. Experiencing health equity is experiencing a long, healthy life where you can work, you can thrive, and really just live. And so I think that we really just need to work at that beginning part to set kids off on the right phase. And you guys are all at the front line. And so I just thank you for all your work you're doing. And I just really hope that within the next 10 years of us being here, that we're just going to see huge improvements in this area. So, but I welcome any questions or answers. Also, we're probably running short on time, but I'm completely approachable. Come and find me. We're also going to do more genetics talks at a symposium, I think tomorrow. So, but thank you for being here. let's do it on the next one.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Megan. What a heartbreaking quote, those quotes from the families. And I think we can unpack. I think there's opportunities for genetic counselors to make a difference in families where there's already a child who has cystic fibrosis, to communicate with the Department of Health so that we so that we really understand and communicate with the families about how to interpret a newborn screen. The chat and the app, please feel free to use Q&A. We're going to bring all the speakers back together at the end because while in some ways moving from newborn screening to theratyping seems like a jump, it's going to get tied all together with Dr. Januska. But now I bring up Dr. John Brewington. And let me get your talk queued up.
Thanks.
Absolutely.
Probably break it if you let me try. So
I got you. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Good morning, guys. Thanks for coming out first thing in the morning. I appreciate it. A huge thanks to be allowed to come and be a part of the group. Very excited to be here. As mentioned, I'm John. I'm a pediatric pulmonologist, and I'm going to think about sort of personalized medicine and theratyping approaches for what do we do when we have someone that doesn't have access to drug but may have benefit from it. I do not have any financial disclosures. I will mention. There we go. My one important disclosure is that, as I said, I'm a pediatric pulmonologist. I'm not a genetic counselor, so forgive me for adhering to legacy nomenclature throughout the talk, and also go easy on me when it comes to questions. Okay, it's an agreement here. Also, I'm an honorary Megan today. I'm the one speaker not named Megan, so I'm excited to have Megan Pride. So, Dr. McGarry did such an incredible job of highlighting the current landscape of modulator care in CF. And I'm going to shift from thinking about racial and ethnic diversity to thinking about really allelic diversity, so genetic diversity at the CFTR locus. But I don't want us to forget the lessons that she's taught us. Because as I go through this and I share some of the data that we've generated, while I don't call it out explicitly, know that the patients that we're working with are frequently patients from racial and ethnic minority groups, because they do more frequently not have access to these drugs. So I don't want us to forget that as we shift to a different type of conversation about diversity. Now, when I step back and I look at sort of a genotype-specific prescribing pattern for CFTR modulators, it's a great thing to say that we have access for 85+% of the population, but there's major issues with that, and we've highlighted some already. I see two things that we can work on to improve, and this is what our lab has worked with. One is a gap in access, and that's what I'll focus on today. So patients that may have benefit biologically to a drug that already exists, but simply have no pathway to actually make use of it. There is also an emerging precision gap, and this is only going to increase, where we have patients that may have access to multiple drugs, and the data that exists to let us know which drug is the right drug for them are limited, although oftentimes common sense can help guide us. I'm not going to focus on that today, though. And so theratyping is the word that we like to toss around. And again, I'm sure you guys are all familiar with that. But just to state it explicitly, that means instead of asking at a biologic level, what's wrong with the protein that makes it dysfunctional, saying instead, what's the drug I can use to make it better? This is what my patients ask me, right? No patient comes to me and says, do I have a type 1 or a type 3 mutation? They say, what can you give me to make me better? And so you can do this theratyping approach in a lot of different ways. The best track record here in the United States, at least as far as impact at the global or at the total CF population, has been large-scale testing of individual variants in non-human model systems. Fisher rat thyroid or FRT cells, those libraries that Vertex has used to push the label expansion out to where we stand today. I'm going to think, though, at the small scale. So individuals, and so a precision or personalized medicine approach. And I'm going to ask you guys to forgive me. I'm a basic scientist, and so I've got to have a couple basic scientist slides through here, and then we'll get to some nitty-gritty about our population and the specific study. But I would posit if you really want to push precision medicine and study of individuals with extremely rare variants, a great way to do it is using patient-specific models. Patient-derived models are a great way to do this because they do give you a response that is unique to the patient. I don't need to tell this group that genetic diversity outside of the CFTR allele is a major impact in the diversity of disease burden. And so a patient-specific model recreates that beyond simply changing the CFTR mutation that's there. Now, both a pro and a con, as we'll talk about a little bit later, is a patient-specific model carries both alleles that the patient has. And so it's a pro because it's specific to that patient and it helps us understand their individual disease. Sometimes it's difficult because you see a response and it's difficult to say this is the variant that responded, which would allow you to spread that information for more use. But again, I think at the individual level, this is a major pro. It's also important to point out that a lot of the models that we use for theratyping, we really cannot, or without significant change and investment, cannot study intronic variants. Most of them are built with a cDNA construct, which means the introns are gone. And so splice type variants, you can't study in those models, but in primary cells you can. And these models recapitulate that non-CFTR genetic variability that we know is there in vivo, we can see in vitro with these models. Now, there's a lot of different patient-derived models out there. I'm going to focus on nasal cells because that's what I do, but in no way is that the only model, or in no way is it superior to other models. And if you go to Europe, there's a lot of gastrointestinal models in use. They're very powerful. They've got a great track record. And we're seeing more and more advancement in stem cell-derived models, which I think are still currently a bit of a high investment to get into, but when you do, the return is significant. And this is going to become more and more commonplace over the years. Almost all of these models, once you generate them, allow you to either look at ion transport or fluid efflux to quantify CFTR function. And so I'll talk about two a little bit more specifically, and that's going to be looking at electrophysiology and air-liquid interface cultures, and then swelling assays and organoid cultures. And then after that, we'll get out of the basic science. So human nasal epithelial cells, or HNEs, are what we do our work with. For folks that have not done this, it's a non-invasive brush. It is uncomfortable. Anyone who's ever had their nose brushed, even for a COVID swab, knows that we're genetically wired that when you stuff something up there far enough, your brain says, no, that's not supposed to be there. But I would argue, and I think most of our subjects agree, that it's no more uncomfortable than venipuncture for a blood draw. So it is uncomfortable, but it's quick and it's over. We were able to get these from anybody with a nose, which is a great way to do it, and it's generally safe, although we do have a couple of exclusion criteria we'll talk about in a minute. Now, our air-liquid interface cultures, for people who aren't familiar with them, are based off of traditional bronchial cell epithelial models that have helped us understand CF along the years. This is where we grow the cells as a sheet, so a two-dimensional sheet. They polarize, so all the cells point in the right direction. And if you were to actually section it and look at it, it looks very similar to what you would get as a biopsy of your airway. All the cell types are there: ciliated cells, mucus-producing goblet-type cells, basal cells. The immunofluorescence, which is probably hard to see with the lighting, shows some tight junctions in green, cilia in purple, mucus in red. But what's important for theratyping is that we can then take these and we can study ion transport. I do this with an Using chamber, although there are other methods to do this. Without getting into the nitty-gritty, whenever CFTR opens up and chloride moves, chloride carries a charge. So if enough of it moves, that's electricity, and you can measure that. And so we're able to generate these electrical tracings like you see in the top right. And from that, pull data down. And in the bottom, we're showing that we can easily tell a wild-type CFTR positive patient from a patient that's homozygous for F508del. And in the two right-hand bars, that with treatment with, in this case, just lumacaftor, so low-level correction, we can easily quantify that in these models. So if you want a model that's going to help you understand if a patient responds to a drug, this is what you need. A model that can tell healthy from non-healthy and can show that physiologic correction when you use drug. The other model that we use, and I will say whenever we get a nasal cell sample into our lab, unless it's for a very particular product or project, if we're working in theratyping specifically, we grow both of these models out. So they grow in parallel. So we have data that allows us to internally collaborate and make sure we've got good solid data. These organoid cultures are based off of the intestinal organoid model, although they're a little bit less complex. If you go and you search for organoid, you'll find these incredible things that people are doing, pushing the frontier into regenerative medicine. These are very simple. It's basically a sphere of cells. There's a lumen on the inside. You can force the cells to grow so that the apex, where the cilia are, focuses to the inside of that lumen or to the outside based on what you want to study. We make them face to the inside. There's immunofluorescence there that shows that, again, they kind of recapitulate that stratified pseudocolumnar epithelium that we think about from the airway. If you force them to grow apex in, when you activate CFTR function, if it works, chloride and other ions will move into the center, fluid will follow that, and they'll swell. They get bigger over time. And so we can quantify that, mask it out as is shown there on the bottom left. And on the right-hand side, again, just highlighting that we can easily tell wild-type CFTR in the white bar from F508del homozygous CFTR in the first gray bar. And between the two gray bars, we can correct that F508del and show that functional restoration. So two models that allow us to do what we need to do this type of theratyping work. All right, that's the basic science. We'll move on. So we have been lucky enough for the last 4 years to be funded as a national resource center through the CF Foundation. So in Cincinnati, we were able to get samples from all over the country. Because of some regulatory limitations, it does need to be in the United States. My apologies to anyone who's not. We're still working with that. But anywhere in the country. My team is shown here. Rory is my regulatory guru. She's our primary patient point of contact. Hunter is a wizard when it comes to cell culture. He can make anything grow. And Alicia and Jessica run our assays and generate our primary data. They are all wizards, and we couldn't even begin to do this without them. For eligibility for our theratyping work, patients need to have either a confirmed or a suspicion of a diagnosis of CF. I'll mention that again here in a couple of slides. Currently, we are only accepting patients that are not modulator eligible. If there's significant extenuating circumstances, such as a patient who may have a label indication but can't take it because of a certain reason, I'm happy to talk about that. But because we have limited throughput, and as we continue to work to validate and learn about these models, we want to maximize the potential benefit that comes from them. We're only accepting at this point people who are not modulator eligible. And also individuals who have at least one missense or unidentified variant. Folks that have 2 nonsense variants that we don't anticipate would ever be able to respond to a modulator drug, we're not accepting at this time. The local center needs to be able and willing to brush the patient, and the patient needs to be at least 6 months old. As I mentioned, if you have significant nasal disease, typically significant polyposis that would make it difficult to get a brush in the nose safely, or a bleeding disorder that would make it unsafe, these are patients that we would not enroll. And then there's a very, very short list of confirmed non-responsive variants that we have tested in a large cohort, and by large I mean typically 10 plus individuals, and not seen response to the drugs. If there's a new drug that comes available, this goes back in the trash can and we start fresh. But where it stands now, that's just a couple of canonical splice variants, I507del and R560T. Those are the ones that are on that list at the moment. As far as screening goes, if you have a subject or a patient in your group that you think may benefit from this or may be eligible, just reach out to me and Rory, and I'll have our emails on the last slide of the talk so you guys can grab that. And we'll run through their CFTR genotype and again confirm with you that they either have a diagnosis or a suspicion of CF. We do ask that you don't send us PHI. Oftentimes people will reach out and say, hey, Joe Smith in my center is great. Here's his medical record number. Don't do that. Just let us know the CFTR genotype. And then we'll ask you to provide our information to the subject. They can call us directly. We go through the consent process, which includes consent to speak with the folks at the center. And so when we consent the patient, we're also consenting them to have an open conversation with the center and to share data back once it's all said and done. We work through the logistics, set up a local collection. We ship everything that's needed for that out, including everything that's needed to ship it back. There is no cost because this is grant funded, and so no cost to either the local center or to the subject. Now, once we get the cells back in the lab, the models take about 2 to 3 months to grow. It's not a short process. And unfortunately, there is still about a 1 in 5 sample loss to contamination or to cells that simply don't take off and grow. This is something that has come down significantly over the last 2 to 3 years. We have a number of different things in place that we're working on. We always have 2 or 3 initiatives we're looking at to make this better because we know how frustrating it is for the patients, for their families, and for the local center when this happens. And so our goal is to get this number as low as possible. Unfortunately, when things come out of the nose, everything comes out of the nose. And so we often get bacteria and fungus that comes along for the ride, and we're working on it. Once we get to the data point, we do return this back to the patient and to their provider that's identified in the conversations on the front end. And it's important for you guys to know that based on our IRB, we provide that information back to the patient and to the provider at the same time. And so the patient gets it at the same time as the provider. Most people are perfectly fine with that. There are some people who say, I would really prefer to have known that myself so that then I can prepare my conversation with the patient. This is what my IRB asks me to do at this point, so my hands are somewhat tied on that, but just so you guys know. Now, if the patient does have a response to drug, we package that information into a very simple letter. This is not intended to be legible at this distance. It's just to highlight that it is actually a very simple letter. I learned early on that if we make a really complex letter that has a lot of basic science information in it, the insurance companies will not read it. And so we keep it very simple. Here's a little information about the CFTR variants that are involved, a little information about our basic science protocols, the data itself, and our final recommendation. It's typically 2 pages or less. We share this back with the center and with the individual, and then they can ping the insurance company for off-label coverage. The question, though, is does it work? And the broad answer is yes, but not always. So the nasal cell theratyping efforts that we've done to date have spread across actually 90 plus centers across the country. So we really have gone coast to coast with this. We have standardized processes to facilitate that. And I do a lot of work with nasal cells. Like I said, I'm a basic scientist. We've gotten over 600, I think the number may be 700 now, samples for lots of different studies and purposes. But we'll think about just the theratyping studies for the next few slides. And so that number is 252 through the end of this summer. And so that's 252 people with a suspected diagnosis of CF, at least one rare missense mutation or an unidentified mutation, and that were just obtained for theratyping, not cells that we got for anything else. Now, I'm happy to talk about this offline or in the questions later on, but I'm just going to state it for now and go through the next few slides. I'm going to define a response, what I say is a response to modulator, as a bump of at least 5% of wild type function that gets us over a 10% of wild type threshold. That 10% number is the same number that's been used in FRT models along the way for expansion of the label. And there's also a lot of internal data that we've used to define that. We look at that formally at least twice a year and informally every week. And so, but again, this is what we'll use for the purpose of the next few slides. Happy to chat more about that later. Now, using that 10% threshold line, of the 252 subjects, in about a third, 77 of them, we do see a response to one variant. This number is smaller than I would like, but larger than I expected. And so there is a good number of folks who do respond. And of those 77 individuals, 52 have been able to get onto off-label coverage for drug, again, using that sort of simple letter as a backup. Now, we also have siblings of individuals that have been able to use their SIB data to get on drug, and some unrelated individuals. That number is actually higher than one now as we've started to share some larger cohort data. The breakdown of the drugs that people respond to is over there on the far right. I will say that since we've had ETI in the lab, since late 2019, that has been the primary drug that we see response to, although we do also see individuals respond to ivacaftor, especially if they have high residual function at baseline. We have not had anybody that responds greater to Teziva or Lumiva than ETI since we started using ETI, but we still test it just to make sure. This is plotting just the baseline function on the x-axis across the max modulated function on the y. There is a 2-to-1 ratio of the y to x. That's why it's not a more 45-degree line. But when you plot out that line, what we see is the average increase in CFTR function among these responders is about 15 to 20% of wild type. So it is a pretty significant bump. The cohort in general is young with an average age of about 24. They are almost evenly split male-female. There is slightly higher baseline function amongst the non-responder group, which I'm going to show you why in a moment. And amongst the responders, as I mentioned, if you look by which drug did they respond to, those that respond to ivacaftor tend to have a higher baseline function. These are individuals with residual function variants typically. This is a list of the variants that we've had response to, and I've broken them down into confirmed on the top and possible on the bottom. And feel free to take a picture of this, but I'll also say if at any point you are thinking, I wonder if they've tested that, please just email us. We will always be happy to share with you if we've tested a variant and what we've seen. When I say confirmed on the top, I mean that either we had a homozygote, which is quite rare in our cohort, or we had a patient who had another allele in trans that we know was not responding, R542X, those kinds, or G542X, those kinds of things. Possible on the bottom means that it wasn't that case. So maybe there were two alleles that were in trans that could have either been responsive, could have both been responsive, and we can't put our finger on it. We don't know. Now, the non-responders of this group, 175 individuals, you'll notice that many of them, where we plot out again the baseline function versus the modulated function, many of them have normal CFTR function at baseline. I said that you have to have a confirmed or a suspected diagnosis of CF. And so we get lots of people where the team will reach out and they'll say, especially in adult centers, here's somebody who I think might have CF, but they've got a sweat chloride that's indeterminate and I'm not sure, but man, if you told me ivacaftor would make them better, I would absolutely call them CF and prescribe it. And so many of those individuals will have normal CFTR function in our models. I'll talk in a few slides about what we do with that, if anything, but that does skew those numbers higher. But in this group of 175 individuals, we've had 24 that we tested and saw no response that subsequently had an on-label drug option. 18 of them are people who we didn't have that drug to test with, almost exclusively F508del heterozygotes who are now on label for Trikafta. But 6 are people that we did test a drug with, and we didn't see a response. And so we have to ask ourselves, are these 6 misses? Are these people that we have done a disservice to by seeing that there is no response in the models? Now, the genotypes are listed there, and in the next slide, I'm going to go into that in more depth, sort of one by one. This is a busy slide, so forgive me. but kind of taking each one of those 6 individuals, because again, for us, for me at least as a physician, the potential misses are the things that keep me up at night. And so we want to spend a lot of time thinking about them. The first one is a homozygote for this non-canonical splice that I suspect everybody in the room is very familiar with, and clinically has a quite variable phenotype from person to person. This person was actually in Cincinnati, and so we were able to do a blinded crossover N-of-1 study, putting them on drug, putting them on placebo, and they actually didn't have any benefit from the drug. Now, their sweat chloride was 16 to start with, so we can have a whole different conversation about whether or not the diagnosis of CF is appropriate here. But I don't think this one was a miss, and I think we've got good clinical data to back that up. We've got one individual with a complex allele. H939R is on label for ETI. The second variant in that complex allele, variant in that complex allele is not, and so we're not sure what to make of that. R347P is one that vexed us for a while in the lab. We feel like we've got maybe a little validation on that. This is one that is on label for ETI. We've tested 5 individuals in our era of ETI. 2 have been responders, 1 a robust responder, and 3 were non-responders. Now, many of you are aware that the collaboration between the CFFT labs, Emory, and the folks in Texas have published some of their FRT data up to bioRxiv. It's not fully published yet, but they've got this FRT library of over 600 variants. And I don't have much that I can go to validate my data against, because unfortunately I can't get the Vertex FRT data, and so there's just not much out there for me to look against. So even though it's not published yet, I don't want to make too much of a deal about a preprint. I went and I looked, and it turns out in their hands, R347P is a borderline responder as well, which I think matches with what we see in the nasal cells. And then the last one was an adult that had I148T, which was non-responsive in our hands. It is on label for ETI. It was responsive in those CFFT data. Although many of you guys will be familiar that variant is typically characterized as non-disease causing, but it often runs as a complex allele with an in-frame deletion that can be disease causing. And this patient had genetic report that was 15 years old that was not full sequencing, and so I do not know if they have that complex allele or not. So potential misses, but I think overall things that probably align with what we would expect. I did just sort of off the cuff take all the fair comparisons, so variants that you could test in FRTs in our cohort amongst responders and non-responders, and compare that against that preprint data. Again, I don't want to make too big of a deal about a preprint, but I use what I can for validation. And if you look at them, actually about 75% of our responders align with what they see response in. There is a group of folks that we saw a response in that was reported as non-responsive in the FRTs, and also a group that we tested that they did not. And these aren't splice variants, these are missense variants that could be tested in an FRT that are represented in our data set, but not theirs. And then amongst non-responders, we've got about 85% concordance between our data and theirs, with just the 2 individuals that we said were non-responders that I've already talked about here on the slide, and then another chunk of folks that we've tested that they have not. So overall, pretty good concordance between the data sets in general. Now, a couple things just to kind of kick off discussion for later, and things that we talk about in the lab a lot. The one that we focus on a great deal is how to approach variability in the lab methods. So there's patient-to-patient variance, and that's what we want to capitalize on, but there's also significant lab-to-lab variance. And in fact, if you look at published data in nasal cells, my data versus other groups, for example, you can find up to 10-fold difference in what we define as healthy control numbers. And so there's huge differences. And a few folks here, folks from Colorado and from Australia, have shown that just tiny little changes in the way you grow your cells or the way you test your cells lead to significant differences in the data you generate. And so if we want to be able to do this at a high level across multiple labs, we need to start thinking about harmonized protocols. And I'm part of a group that's starting to work on some of that. I mentioned the suspicion of CF. I saw some nods in the room when I mentioned this. I don't think this is a new conversation for any of us. And I frequently get asked, can you use these cells as a diagnostic tool? My answer is no, it's not a validated diagnostic tool. Could we potentially get there? Yes. And I think it's something that we should be thinking about. Obviously, we need to address that variability part first, right? You got to be able to actually know that the data you generate is valid. We need a larger cohort of normative data to be able to develop cutoffs. But there is high interest from the community, and as I operate our NPD protocol in Cincinnati as well, and when I talk to centers, it seems like there's fewer and fewer active NPD sites over the years, and so it can be difficult to tease apart patients that are in that gray zone sometimes. This was part of a early work, the left and the right-hand groups, wild type and F5 delta homozygotes, when we were first validating these models. And the cohort in the middle is a group that we generated that was part of a much larger cohort that Daniele Salinas and some of her colleagues in California had put together. But we published some of those data a couple years ago. But it's all kids that were CF SPID, where you might expect them to fall in the middle of the range, and things march out as they would. So again, biologically, it's very plausible that you could, with the work, use these for diagnosis. And then I think probably most relevant for this group is the question of how are we going to share these data in a broader fashion? I was having a conversation with a colleague walking over here saying, yeah, it's great data, but we really need to figure out how to share it better so it can be better used. We always share this back to the patient, the physician dyad for their own individual use. We have some cohort data with more common variants. N1303K is one of those where we have actually at this point just a de-identified block letter. So if you have a patient with N1303K, we do have a letter that supports that they may benefit from ETI. And there is clinical data emerging that the benefit they get from it is actually far more than what we see in the models. There's some case reports out there for that. But beyond that, what's the right forum? I CFTR2 is on my homepage, right? So I use it all the time. But most of the databases like that, which are incredible resources, think about alleles one at a time, and most of our data does not. And so how do you harmonize those two things, and how do we go from there? And specifically, like, how do you deal with that heterozygote data? Out of our 77 responders, there are 5 homozygotes in that whole cohort. And so I've got 72 hets. Now, many of them have something in trans that I can put my finger on and say, no, that didn't respond. But most of them do not. Something that we ask ourselves a lot about is, at what point does having 2 rare or personal variants become PHI? At what point is it not my right to share those 2 variants together? Maybe I can tease them apart and say this variant is or this variant is responsive, but at what point is sharing those 2 variants together moving into PHI? And then lastly, I think there's a few variants out there. I talked about R347P. W1282X, I think, is a poster child for this, where both in our models and other models and in clinical reports, there are reports of individuals that may have benefit from ivacaftor specifically, but it's in no way universal. So what do you do with that? You just report that as a maybe responder. So lots of questions for us to ask, and again, hopefully conversations for later. I'll end here. I'll say again, hopefully I've convinced you that we can use this to have patient-specific study that can ultimately create a pathway of access for people who have biologic benefit from drug but don't have access to it. And again, this is accessible across the country now through our National Resource Center. This is sent to us from one of our subjects through the theratyping pipeline, who happens to be an artist. And so it makes its way into almost every talk I give. Here's my email and Roy's email. If you have someone that you think may qualify, please just reach out to us. We're happy to chat through things, chat through the process. Again, please don't include PHI in the communication, and we'll go from there. So thanks for your attention. A huge thanks again to my crew for everything they've done to put these data together, and look forward to questions later.
Thank you so much. You can definitely hold your own in a room full of genetic counselors. Thank you. And Megan's too. Yes, thank you, Becky. All right, and our third speaker will kind of tie this all together. It's Megan Januska from Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. And thank you for putting questions in the chat. We'll use those and in addition to any that come up to the microphone when we have all 3 speakers come up at the end.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name's Megan Januska, like Eleanor said, and it's an honor to be invited to be on this panel. Thank you, Becky and Eleanor, and a true honor to be on a panel with Drs. McGarry and Brewington, whose research I've looked up to for many years now. So hopefully I can put a little bit of a face onto everything that they've already spoke about and give you a little bit more context for why this is important and a few patient stories. Maybe if I can click through. Aha. So I have no relationships to disclose related to this presentation, but I will be speaking about the off-label use of both ivacaftor and elexacaftor, tezacaftor, ivacaftor. So when the first CFTR modulator therapy, ivacaftor, achieved FDA approval in the United States in 2012, most people in this room, if not everyone, have seen firsthand the tremendous advancements and tremendous benefit that our patients are getting for being on CFTR modulator therapies. So just to get back to the data for a minute, These figures are from the now landmark study evaluating ivacaftor in people with cystic fibrosis 12 years of age and older with at least one G551D variant. And the primary endpoint in their study was an absolute change in percent predicted FEV1. And you can see the tremendous benefit, about 10% increase on those who were on ivacaftor. And they had secondary endpoints such as the time to first pulmonary exacerbation, which we'll talk about a lot in the upcoming slides, reported respiratory symptoms, change in weight, and you can see huge changes in weight in the ivacaftor group, and then change in sweat chloride level. And a lot of those who actually were on treatment had sweat chlorides that fell below that 60 diagnostic level. And similar figures could be put up for elexacaftor, tezacaftor, ivacaftor in the Delta F508 group, but that's not the focus of this talk, so I'm going to keep moving on. So our first case is actually an 11-year-old female of Mexican ancestry with cystic fibrosis. Her genotype is there, who had actually been followed at our cystic fibrosis center since birth. And for those of you who are astute and know your modulators, her second variant T1036N now has approval for 2 modulators, tezacaftor, ivacaftor, and ETI, or elexacaftor, tezacaftor, ivacaftor. That I'm going to stop saying now because that's a mouthful, so I'm going to say ETI. But at the time, neither of those had approval. And so hearkening back to diagnosis and Dr. McGarry's talk, she actually had a positive cystic fibrosis New York State newborn screening. Her IRT was very high. At the time that she was born, we had a 39 CFTR variant panel, so neither one of her mutations or her variants were picked up. But we have a very high IRT category. So because her IRT was in the top 0.2% of IRTs on the day that her newborn screening was sent, she actually had a positive newborn screen. And now in New York State, the threshold has been increased to the top 0.1%. But because of that, she was actually sent to us quite early. She had a sweat chloride testing that was diagnostic for CF at 2 months of age and had sequencing at that time that gave us her genotype. So if we look back to Dr. McGarry's talk, if you go back to the ACGME panel, neither one of her variants would have shown up. Neither one of her variants would have been on the Illumina 139. The T1036N is on the CFTR2 panel, and New York State now has a 369 CFTR variant tier 2 panel, and so the T1036N is also on that. So at 11 years of age, she had a clinical downtrend whereby she required 2 hospitalizations less than 6 months apart for pulmonary exacerbations that required IV antibiotics after failing outpatient medical management. And this is her chest x-ray from 11 years of age. And you can see, we don't normally diagnose bronchiectasis on chest x-rays, but she has a lot of what looks like bronchiectasis. There's some, I don't know if you can, no, you can't see my mouse, some scar. Thank you. They don't teach you all the technical stuff beforehand. But there is some scarring here. And then you can just see that there's this like an overall haziness, whiteness, which is probably a lot of mucus in the bronchiectatic airways. And she was pancreatic insufficient, and for most of her life, she was doing really quite well. This black line is a BMI of 50%, which is where we like to keep our kids. And at 11 years of age, she just kind of dropped, and she just could not gain that weight back. And so we think about theratyping. And actually, we reached out to Dr. Brewington and his lab about the potential for theratyping for this patient. And we sent her nasal respiratory cells, and we got a lovely 2-page letter back that included this diagram. And her baseline CFTR protein function was, not surprisingly, reduced and was estimated to be about 2.5% of wild-type function. And there was improvement with exposure to all of the existing CFTR modulator therapies, but it was most pronounced with ETI. Increasing her CFTR protein function to approximately 16% of wild-type activity, so meeting that threshold that Dr. Brewington mentioned. And he provided us with a letter, and we leveraged that data to petition her insurance carrier to approve the off-label application of ETI at 12 years of age. And after a few squabbles back and forth with the insurance company, because even though you have a letter, it's not always straightforward, she started at 12 years of age. She's had no hospitalization since then. Her respiratory symptoms have improved. This is her pre-ETI to post-ETI chest x-ray. So you see she still has scarring and still has evidence of structural lung disease, but a lot of that mucus that you can kind of tell is in the airways is gone. And she had improved weight gain. So This is when she was really quite sick. This is post-ETI, and you can see that she's way back on her curve, and she's thriving as a teenager. So we're dealing with teenage problems, but we're not dealing with health problems at this point. So a true success story. Sorry. Our second case is a little bit different. So this is a 4-year-old male of Ecuadorian ancestry with cystic fibrosis, and he's homozygous for H609R, which is one of the more rare variants. And he was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis at 8 months of age. So Dr. McGarry spoke about delayed diagnosis, and he fits into that category. So he was actually diagnosed after his 5th hospitalization for dehydration and electrolyte derangements. He had a negative CF New York State newborn screening. His IRT was 88.9, and we had a 39 CFTR variant panel at the time, and that was negative. Somebody astute had actually thought about CF at one point and had actually sweated him at 6 months of age, and his sweat chloride testing was consistent with the diagnosis of CF, but it looks like nobody did anything with that data. We met him at 8 months of age and repeated his sweat chloride testing, at which point it was diagnostic at 73 in both arms. And he ended up having sequencing that revealed homozygosity for the H609R variant at 9 months of age. So again, going back to Dr. McGarry's presentation, would the ACGME panel picked him up? No. The Illumina 139 would not have picked him up. CFTR2 would, and H609 is actually on the New York State panel right now. So had he been born today, he would have had a positive New York State newborn screening. So he was diagnosed at 8 months of age. He had an additional 6 hospitalizations over the next 2 years, all for pulmonary exacerbations that required IV antibiotics after failure of outpatient medical management. And when I tell you that this mom was doing everything that she possibly could for this kid, she was doing everything that she possibly could. And you see his chest X-ray here. This is him at 3. This is advanced lung disease for a 3-year-old. He was pancreatic sufficient, so weight gain was not a problem for him, and he was mostly above the 50th percentile for BMI for the majority of his life. And so we thought, theratyping, right? Noticing a trend here. But unfortunately, his nasal epithelial cells just did not grow. So we tried. We were a little stuck at this point. This is a kid who's in and out of the hospital. We've kind of used the one route that we had to hopefully get him onto therapy. And if you were to search the literature today, and this wasn't available back when we were thinking about him, there's this one manuscript by LaSalva and colleagues where they measured CFTR protein function through a membrane depolarization assay, so a little bit different, in human embryonic kidney grip-tight cells, or HEC293 cells for those that are in the basic science world, that were transiently transfected with H609R. And this red line, whoops, I keep using the wrong screen. This red line here looks at stimulation of these cells with forskolin and VX770, which is ivacaftor, and there's not really a great response. But this blue line looks at stimulation with the same ivacaftor, but adding elexacaftor and tezacaftor, so essentially Trikafta, and there's a huge response. And so this would theoretically suggest that maybe there's some potential therapeutic utility for ETI in this patient. But like I said, we didn't have this data at this time. So at 4 years of age, we decided we were just going to ask his insurance carrier to approve the off-label application of ivacaftor and see what happened. And you're thinking, why did we choose ivacaftor? There's four therapies to choose from. Well, one, it was the only FDA-approved CFTR modulator therapy for his age group at the time. So he was 4. It was the only one that was available that was at least on label for age. We had surmised that he probably had some residual CFTR protein function. He was pancreatic sufficient, and ivacaftor at that time had already garnered FDA approval for 23 different CFTR variants that were documented to also confer residual CFTR protein function. So we thought that it might work, and we at our center had experience with it already. And we had basically done everything that we could think of to take care of this kid. And he was heading down that path where he was going to go into chronic respiratory failure, maybe head down to the lung transplant path. And we were concerned that H609R would never be studied or approved individually due to its relative rarity. There's only 9 people in CFTR2 that have this variant. So then you have to think about the other side. Why not ivacaftor, right? So we didn't know if it would work. It's kind of We had suspicions, we had a hypothesis that it might work, but no data proving that that was to be true. There are side effects, right? We screen all of our kids for cataracts, we follow their LFTs, we look at their liver. Are we potentially giving him a drug that has no benefit, that's going to cause harm? And there's significant financial cost, maybe not to the patient themselves, but we think about societally, these medicines cost hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. And if we're using them kind of willy-nilly, then we're costing society a lot of money for maybe no benefit. So that's where we were. We had a year-long battle with his insurance carrier that there are some people in this room that I believe would be happy to talk to you about this in a little bit more detail. So we sent the prescription, they said no. Not surprising. They asked for a peer-to-peer, they said no. We actually ended up going to a fair hearing for him. And this fair hearing was predicated on both written and oral testimony from a lot of members of our CF care team. So we had physicians that went, we had genetic counselors that went and advocated, we have social workers that went and advocated, and their testimony included published data that outlined ivacaftor's mechanism of action and the overall safety profile. It outlined our rationale for choosing ivacaftor and the limitations that we were kind of at. We had no other avenues for action at the time, and we were kind of at an impasse. And we didn't think that we could wait. So he was started on off-label ivacaftor at 5 years of age. He has had no further hospitalizations, so he had about 10 in his life. He's about 9 or 10 now, so we've doubled his life, no hospitalizations. His respiratory symptoms improved within weeks. We got to downgrade his medical treatment a lot. He was doing airway clearance 4 times a day, and now he's down to twice. His chest x-ray looked a lot better. We actually repeated his sweat chloride testing, and that dropped down to the indeterminate level. And this, I think a lot of people are struggling with. He also had tremendous weight gain, which was not what we were looking for, and is another issue that we're dealing with now. And if I caught Dr. Brewington's slides right, I believe H609R is confirmed as responsive in your data, and this might go ways to support that. So that's him, another success, but a longer path to get there. My last case for you guys is a 3-month-old female, also of Ecuadorian ancestry with cystic fibrosis, her genotype's up there, and she developed new right upper lobe atelectasis in the setting of a viral illness, interestingly not a respiratory viral illness. So you can see that her right upper lobe is completely collapsed down here. And for her diagnosis, she had a positive cystic fibrosis New York State newborn screening. Her IRT was elevated at 119, and we actually detected both of her variants. Only the G85E is on our panel, but our third tier in New York State is sequencing. So after her first variant was detected, we actually had sequencing, so we knew her genotype when she walked into the door. Her sweat chloride testing was diagnostic for cystic fibrosis at 3 weeks of age. And again, if you look at Dr. McGarry's outline, her G6 or her G85E would have been detected on all of these panels. So for her clinical course, after that first evidence of atelectasis, we had optimized her medical therapy. She didn't really get better, so we ended up doing a flexible bronchoscopy and instilling pulmozyme or Dornase alpha right into that lobe. And even after that, she had increased work of breathing with subcostal retractions. And her weight gain, she dropped from the 47th percentile down to the 1st percentile. So we had a problem. And at 5 months of age, we actually petitioned her insurance carrier to also approve the off-label application of ivacaftor. Now, we did not send her for theratyping. At this point in her life, she was constantly in and out of the hospital. She was going to procedures. And now hearing Dr. Brewington speak, she was probably too young for him to even take her. And one of her CFTR variants, G85E, had actually had an approved CFTR modulator at the time, but it was Trikafta, and she was just too young to take it. So again, same questions. Why ivacaftor? Well, it was the only FDA-approved CFTR modulator for her age group at the time. We also surmised residual CFTR protein function for her, and hers might be a little bit more tricky to get on board with. She was pancreatic insufficient, but her stool fecal elastase kind of wavered. Sometimes they were as high as 180, where the threshold is 200, so maybe she had mild pancreatic insufficiency, and she still had some residual function. We actually have another patient in our CF center with their same genotype who's pancreatic sufficient. So while genotype doesn't always equate with phenotype, there was some inkling that maybe there's some residual function there. And in a communication with the foundation, actually, we were informed that W496R is associated with approximately 2 to 4% residual function. And as I touched on before, variants that confer some sort of residual function are among the best candidates to be clinically responsive to ivacaftor. And finally, we just couldn't wait 5 years. She was a kid who was rapidly losing weight, not gaining weight, in and out of the hospital. 5 years was an extraordinarily long time. So why not ivacaftor? Same things, questionable efficacy, possible side effects associated with significant financial cost. So our last patient, we went through a whole year-long process. This one, we learned a little bit, took us about a month. So she started off-label ivacaftor at 6 months of age. Now, she was quite sick, so ivacaftor wasn't the only intervention that we were doing at the time. So C, or the X-ray on the left, is her post-ivacaftor and concomitant bronchoscopy chest X-ray. And you see that there's some aeration that's starting to come into this right upper lobe, and there's a CT scan that's associated where instead of her whole lobe being down, it was only part of it. And this is a few months later with one more bronchoscopy where we have almost complete aeration of her right upper lobe. But more importantly, her weight gain changed tremendously. She ended up going from below the 1st percentile to above the 5th percentile during the hospital admission where she started ivacaftor. And subjectively, because I went in her airways with a bronchoscopy, her mucus looked thinner visibly. Interestingly, her sweat chloride testing did not change. So this is a conversation to still have. That being said, she's about 18 months old right now. And we plan to transition her from ivacaftor to ETI when she hits 2 years, because at that point, her G85E variant will qualify her. So we can talk more about any of that. But like to echo what Dr. Brewington said, one of the ways to improve access is to provide existing therapies to those people with cystic fibrosis who may benefit but don't have an FDA-approved CFTR variant. And the way to get there is programs like Dr. Brewington's in the National Theratyping Center. But it also takes ongoing advocacy from the clinical care teams. You can't just expect to send a nasal sample to the Brewington lab and get a letter back and think that's it. It's never it. There are telephone calls and letters, and it's the whole team that's advocating for the patient. And then Dr. Brewington touched on this as well, but thoughtful sharing of data and experiences. So whether that's in the form of case reports or presentations like these, we have to figure out a way to disseminate this information so that not just the who qualifies and how we can get drug, but how people go about making that happen for their patients, those shared experiences, because we've certainly gotten better over time. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Becky and Eleanor, and I think we can do questions.
Okay, pick a chair. Any chair? One missing. Oh, there's one missing. Okay. Oh, someone will stand up here. Oh, okay. That'll be me right now.
Okay, so we'll have all 3 speakers come up. There's some really app, but thank you, Dr. Januska. You really tied it all together. Do you want No, I'll stand. I'll keep an eye on things. All right. Would anybody like to come to the mic, which I can't see past this big screen, but okay. All right, so we'll start in some order so that we can keep track. So I think this is for Dr. Brewington. For non-responders, are you sequencing CFTR to either confirm the reported genotype or make sure there isn't anything else unidentified in CFTR that would impact drug response?
I wish the answer to that was yes. The answer is no at the moment, but it's something we talk about a lot. So really, really awesome question. I think whether it's in CFTR or not, sequencing will give us a lot more information. I will say the degree and depth of genetic information that we get when it comes to CFTR genotype is highly variable. And it ranges from full sequencing, frequently in patients from states that have full sequencing as part of their screening protocol, or diverse populations where that's just what they do as a standard, to often adult reports that are 20 years old that were done with a 23 variant panel, and that's all we've got. And so because we rely on the data that's provided from the clinical center, that's what we have. We've talked a lot about what our thresholds would be to do additional sequencing. From a regulatory standpoint, that's an additional conversation with the IRB going back, because it does involve the genetic side of things as far as sequencing data. And so that's a step we haven't taken, but I think it's a really important conversation.
If I could piggyback on that same concept or question, a few of the reports were people who are homozygous for something that might be relatively rare. Is it a consideration that they may have a deletion on the one allele? Is that something that's investigated by looking for heterozygosity at other points? Or it may just limit the response then if you're really only targeting one allele.
Yeah, absolutely.
And potentially these are questions that could go back to the clinical team that they could
Right.
we could investigate further. All right. Another question for Dr. Brewington. Any experience with the 5T allele and theratyping? If you could comment on that.
Take it away. Here.
Yes. Yeah, the short version is yes. It's not universal, and as you can imagine, the baseline function we get off of individuals who come in that have typically something in trans with a 5T. Most of our experience is with 5T and either 12 or 13 TG. Oftentimes the residual function or the baseline function is quite high to start with. And so many of those patients are in that conversation of, okay, so their function moved from 85% to 88%. That probably doesn't matter, but you have to put that in the clinical context. And so in those cases, we provide the data at face value. In general, those, if there is response for individuals who have a single identified variant and then a 5T that we believe to be in trans, it's typically ivacaftor is the responsive drug. But it's not as big of a number as you would imagine. It's far more common for us to get sequencing that just has a single variant, and we operate on the assumption that there is a second unidentified variant that would be something T, but we don't know. So it's more common that we don't know the poly T status than we do.
Okay, thank you for that. A question involving maternal carrier screening, which is more and more involving CFTR sequencing. And is there any kind of interface with the newborn screening program and maternal, I'm looking at you, Megan McGarry, yes, and newborn screening to try to communicate that information?
This
and
is
would
like
that
the
help with
bane of my
misses?
existence. I think it's really hard for families when they had prenatal screening that was done for a panel and it doesn't match up with newborn screening, because then they got told they were not carriers and then their newborn screening pops up positive. I mean, it's just the OB/GYN group and it does not seem to even understand about our newborn screening. So we have started trying to go and reach out and like explain. I think there needs to be a huge push across, because it's crazy to test the baby standardly for something that you're not going to standardly test the mom. So it's awful because it's not even talking about the sequencing part. It's just talking about the first panel, but definitely for sequencing. I will have to say that when I got pregnant and was in fertility treatments, my genetic counselor, my husband is Filipino, they had no clue what I did. And they told me, do you know Filipinos get CF2? And I was like, thank you. And they're like, you can't do a panel. You have to do sequencing. And I was like, you are my person. But I think that there's such a message, and that's parents are livid when they find out that why are you doing two different panels? And so it's that's like an easy push, but it's like an easy thing to identify as you should not be doing a routine screening of moms that does not match up what you're going to do to your baby. I don't know how it is in New York. So
No. We also get the instance where parents come in and say, I was told I wasn't a carrier, and then we end up diagnosing their child with cystic fibrosis. And it just really does change the conversation.
And well, I actually probably didn't paraphrase the question, but I think the poser of the question had the opposite. With more and more prenatal screening being done through sequencing methodologies, do you get any heads up? No, I think it was me that didn't quite. But you're 100% right. We get families all the time that come in when mom said, well, I'm a carrier, but my husband isn't, or my partner isn't, so I don't understand how my baby could have CF. I think adding to the complexity of this is that prenatal screening labs often don't report variants of uncertain significance on the prenatal screening, even if it's there for them to see. And it's not until a baby has a positive sweat test do we then kind of move the variant classification from variant of uncertain significance to possibly pathogenic. Yes, Richard, it's your question, so you can clarify it too. As much as you hate the microphone, right?
The audience or genetic counselors, I think it's the right audience to try to get into this a little more.
Mm-hmm.
How are those? So there's a sequence on the mother. We're stuck in the father. Yeah, but if there's something unusual on the mother's screen, like I have no idea how those labs decide to report out a maternal variant, yes or no. In this case, a BUS might be really important, and maybe there's some way to attack that through the labs if there's consistency in how they're reporting unusual variants. Like, do they use CFTR? What are their standards for doing that? Because it could give a heads up that would keep you from missing the baby if it's reported and if someone counsels them appropriately. So I was just curious to know, does anyone know anything about how those variants are called from the maternal screen?
Well, there's someone in the room that probably knows more than the rest of us, but I don't know, Karen, if you want to comment at all about variant calls. But my understanding is that CFTR2 is one of the reputable sources that testing laboratories consult when they're determining whether a variant is pathogenic or likely pathogenic or a VUS, but it's not the only source that they consult.
Yeah, I'm probably not the best person to answer. I'll pass to Jess, who actually works in the
Jess,
lab.
yeah.
But no, but I think I think it's not so much of how the labs are making the call, because at least in the US, they think the labs are supposed to be using ACMG criteria, and to my knowledge, they mostly are. I'm looking at you. Sorry to put you on the spot. They mostly are. The problem is it's generally been accepted that you're not reporting out VUS on a carrier screen. And so if the lab goes through the whole ACMG criteria and still identifies a VUS, then it's not so much like, are they doing the right things? Are they using CFTR2? Are they using all their resources? It's if they've done all that and they still call it something a VUS, then sort of the lab protocol is to not report that on a maternal screen. Now, if you already have a known maternal carrier and you find a VUS in dad, maybe that's a different situation. Maybe you could ask the lab to unblind if you're doing sequencing in the partner of a known carrier. But I think the bigger issue there is just this sort of determination that we don't report VUS on screens.
Yep. And I'd add to that the reason that people have prenatal screening is, well, mostly for reassurance, right? They want to find out that they're negative and they don't have to worry about it. But when both members of a couple are positive, they're making decisions about whether to continue or end a pregnancy. And when you're not really sure if that variant is CF causing, you're putting families in a really tough position to make decisions on very incomplete information. And so I think we're still learning a lot about these variants, and the more work that's done through the registry, through CFTR2, we'll be able to categorize that and be able to at least counsel the families.
And I also say in California, like, it's a huge state. So if it really makes a difference, because often then moms will choose to deliver at like the academic hospital and not the rural small hospital that's far away. So there is big differences in like, the pediatric level at the hospital that these families will choose too. So even if they said like, well, gosh, like we're going to carry this to term no matter what, like it doesn't really matter. Like we've had babies like that, and then they're delivered out and then they're not taken care of properly in like the immediate, like, gosh, this baby's not doing well. So there's a lot of implications about like getting that diagnosis early. So
Yep, 100%. Because if and when the pregnancy is carried to term, there are things that we can do to monitor the pregnancy and help the families anticipate and prepare for a baby who may or may not have special needs, but at least we can make up a birth plan for them as well.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned that, because it's a huge misconception that this is all just about whether you would terminate or not. It's it's not.
Right. but it is a decision on the table that they wouldn't be making otherwise. But we have, Megan Januska has a lot of cases, and we have a baby in the NICU now who has meconium ileus and 2 VUSs that weren't reported by the prenatal screening labs, and so we're dealing with it.
I can add a little bit more, Eleanor, on that lab aspect. And then, so I'm Jessica Belcom. I'm at Mayo. We have a clinical testing lab. We do CF testing, so certainly is not going to be representative of every lab's practice. But I would say generally for a prenatal testing scenario, we would be consulting with the ordering provider ahead of the testing, particularly if we're told that the maternal or one of the parental alleles is a VUS, to better understand kind of what the counseling has been for the family and what they're expecting from the report. In terms of the initial maternal screening, I mean, I guess this may be different for a test that's intended only as a carrier screening test, but I know for us, if we have an order for our CFTR sequencing, regardless of what the indication is, the reporting threshold is anything VUS or higher is reportable. And I would assume that's similar at other clinical testing labs, that according to the ACMG guidelines, VUS, likely path or paths should all be included in the report. And in some cases, even if that's incidentally seen on a carrier screen, it will be, I guess, generally my lab's practice has been to include that and to consult with the ordering provider about what was seen and why it maybe wasn't part of the standard panel. But my main guidance, I guess, would be to talk to the lab that you're testing through. The more information they have about what the clinical indication is and what you're looking for and expecting to get back will help them to make sure that they're aligned to that, or at least that you understand why they would or wouldn't be reporting.
Thanks for that. Hi, Samita.
Hi, I'm Samita from Green Bay, Wisconsin, and I'm a genetic counselor, and I work with families that have preconception or prenatal carrier screening, and labs don't report out VUSs because it would be problematic in other circumstances. But one place where we could impact things in a different way is that if somebody is referred to us who is a CF carrier, and then we are having the discussion with the reproductive partner to say, would you like to have carrier screening? In those cases, if they want to have carrier screening, then me as a genetic counselor, I can request VUSs from that lab, which is what I do. So in that situation, we can definitely do that. And that's after a conversation with the family and saying, okay, we might find out results that are not going to be, even if both of you are carriers, if it's a variant of uncertain significance, here's what that might mean if your baby inherits both of these mutations. So it's a conversation, but we can request VUSs from the lab in that situation.
Thank you. That's a really important point. And unfortunately, not everybody gets to see Sumeda when they are pregnant or planning a pregnancy. Most of the time, as we know, in the pediatric setting, we're seeing the families after the OB has ordered the test, and honestly, often with very good intentions, they've contracted with a lab that does CFTR sequencing, and they're expecting that the families are going to be given the information that they're seeking, which is complete genetic information. And that is not always the case. And there is a lot of lab-to-lab variability as well. Yeah.
One more thing.
Go.
And when you order a test for CFTR sequencing, let's say you do it through Invitae, if you pick the carrier platform, and they're equal tests, but if you pick the carrier platform versus the diagnostic platform, you're going to get two different interpretations. And the diagnostic test is going to give you VUSs, whereas the carrier test will not. So you have to make sure you're cognizant of how you order that.
Another really, really good point. Turning to a question for Megan McGarry. Are the differences in disease course, such as lower PFT and earlier Pseudomonas acquisition, present even in those in racial and ethnic minorities who were diagnosed through newborn screening? The questioner is trying to understand how much of those clinical differences is related to delayed diagnosis. So do you want to look at this on the?
Yeah, so we in all these analysis, part of like the analysis, it's adjusted for people with delayed diagnosis. So, and then and we put in there newborn screening, and it didn't matter. So it doesn't seem. I think that we probably have all seen cases where it really makes an impact, but at least in the models, it doesn't seem to be the main driver of it. But we all definitely have patients where we can see that that is a big cause. So I think that's a really good question. But
I actually have a question for you. I'm assuming that California has piles and piles of newborn screening cards somewhere. And as you're going through and determining other variants, is there a way to go back and retest any of these newborn screening cards and then recontact families who now have a child who has cystic fibrosis?
So I'm trying to find it out. Our Department of Public Health is very underfunded and understaffed right now. So we are running on much minimal staffing. And so it's very difficult to do anything right now. So they're just trying to get the positives reported out. But yeah, it is. I mean, I think this is also part of it is that, you know, all these newborn screening programs have been collecting all this data, and it wasn't really initially set up to be really analyzing and doing quality improvement and figuring out like a nice, easy system. And it's really unfortunate because I think there is a lot of like, as we learn more and more, should we be recontacting, like what's the system in place to be keeping track of these kids where we identify things that we now know more about. So
thanks.
I have a new question if there's no other comments on that one. So I'm Anna Sisler. I'm a genetic counselor in Marshfield, Wisconsin, and we have a more extensive newborn screening program, and our population actually is increasing with more Native American and Black families. And something that I've encountered as that population is increasing is a lot of challenges with kind of education and acceptance of the diagnosis because it's not been traditionally seen in their families and their ancestry. Questions coming up about non-paternity, about if this is just new in the child and parents aren't actually carriers, as we try and talk about reproductive risk in future pregnancies. And so as there's this effort to increase detection, which I think is super important, I'm wondering if any of your programs are also having parallel like education programs that you're developing to make sure that these families, you know, are informed and to increase acceptance and all of those things that come with it.
So we don't have like an education program about it. There's a group of us that do have grants right now that are working on education materials, both for parent facing and then also provider facing, to really try and increase that awareness. Because I think it is a big barrier. You know, we have a lot of our families where one, they've never heard of it before. So they haven't heard of CF. They don't know anybody who is Black or Hispanic with CF. Or Native American with CF. And then, you know, there's just a lot of false information out there, or they're getting questions from other people in the medical community like, oh gosh, are you sure you have CF because you're Black? And so that's like all reinforcing. So there's a lot of breaking down of barriers. There are some, we have made some like a documentary movie clips of people who are Hispanic with CF. And so we have some of that a little bit to start raising awareness. There needs to be a lot more though. And it is like, I think a big, huge issue that, you know, so much of the culture of the CF Foundation and of CF Care is really tailored to non-Hispanic white populations, that we really do need to step back. Besides all these other kind of work is think about like, well, how do we culturally care for these other populations? So.
Thank you. Are there questions to the mic? For Megan Januska, a question about the kinds of electrolyte abnormalities that were noted. I think that was in case 2.
One case.
Yeah, so he was a hyponatremic, hypokalemic, hypochloremic with an elevated serum bicarb. So pretty classic for CF. He was misdiagnosed with a bunch of things. He was worked up for Bartter syndrome. He was worked up for renal disease. He probably had 1.5 billion workups in his 5 hospital admissions. Sorry. Yeah, but he presented pretty classically for CF, just no one was aware. Mm-hmm. And I think being a recent pediatric trainee,
educating pediatric providers is getting harder because they're not seeing it anymore. These kids are doing so well on modulator therapies for those who qualify that I'm seeing more and more pediatric trainees who don't understand cystic fibrosis, who don't know what the diagnosis looks like, who don't know what the clinical phenotype looks like because they're not seeing it. So when we're pushing to educate even families, we have to go back to educate their pediatricians who are interacting with them on a daily basis and may not know what cystic fibrosis looks like anymore.
Yeah, we have trainees that have never like met somebody with CF, versus it used to be that like they all like it was like always, how many people with CF do you have on are you caring for it right now? So it's very different. I think there's been ongoing challenges. So, and I think that's part of the problem is if you still have a high proportion of people who are Hispanic or Black or Asian with very classic severe CF, but now you have a medical community that's not used to taking care of severe CF anymore. And so I think that's going to be a really challenge as we go on, like over this next decade.
Thank you. Couple questions for Dr. Brewington about how much of an increase in function might be clinically significant. So say from 1 to 8%, would that really be a clinical response? And I know I've pushed you on some of those questions over the years. So.
Perfect question, right? So I think the baseline where you start from makes a big difference. If you start at 1%, 5% increase is probably significant. And if you think about our traditional sort of framework of the nonlinearity of CFTR function, those are the people that could benefit the most from the smallest changes. We have sort of, again, at the cohort level, set that arbitrary threshold. When we have someone who is under that but does have a bump of 5% or more, we do always say, hey, this doesn't meet our threshold, but biologically, I think this is something that may be useful. We should have a conversation that's outside of our typical yes/no conversation. And so while when we analyze the data at a high level, we look at it with pretty clear thresholds just to be clean about it. At the individual level, if we have something that we think biologically makes sense, we're very honest about that in the conversations with families and with providers. And again, it's something we continuously come back around. I will be fully transparent in saying that 10% line was based off of our own experience and data with F508del homozygotes on Orkambi, which we decided would be sort of our lower limit of threshold of detection for clinical change. And so it's based off of that. But we've also had conversations with insurance companies where they're like, yeah, 10%, that sounds right. And so there's feedback from that too in it, because again, we want to think about all aspects of where this touches. But our one-to-one conversations are always very honest about the data itself at the individual level. So.
And I appreciate that too. I know I've called, doesn't this look like a doubling of a response? Or and you sometimes are like, back off, Eleanor. And sometimes it's, let's talk about this further. No, it's definitely.
I will say, early on when we first started doing this and we were validating the models, if we saw a statistically significant change, we said, boom, there's a change, there's a difference. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, we had a number of folks that we saw a change that was small, was statistically significant. We're able to get them on drug and they did not have benefit. And so we use that same information to feed back into setting that line. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, and I think also when we think about benefit, do we think about some measurable improvement, or if we're just keeping a person staying on a steady course? And I think we've seen a couple clinical trials where that have quote unquote failed because it didn't show improvement, but maybe kind of held people where they are. And sometimes that needs to be enough. One other question is any experience with totally genotype negative patients who've been theratyped, and how's that going?
Yes, we've had some patients that have been referred to us that have no identified variants. We at least lean a little bit on the diagnostic guidelines and say if you want to send someone with no identified variants, they need to have at least some evidence that they may have CF, indeterminate or positive sweat chloride, or a clinical phenotype that fits really well. And oftentimes these are conversations with, again, it seems to be more common in the adult medicine world. I'm a pediatrician, so I'm agnostic to that clinically, but where folks say, I've got folks that simply fit the clinical phenotype. I don't have the data to back it up otherwise. Our experience with that group is that I would say the majority of them, but not a vast majority, do have CFTR function that falls in the normal range. It makes you go back and say, again, this is not a diagnostic test, but I would at least consider your diagnostic certainty here. But we do have some that come in that there's no identified variants, oftentimes have positive sweat chlorides or indeterminate sweat chlorides, and we see a reduction in function. And we've had a couple, it's not many, but we've had a couple that have had response to modulators, and their teams have tried to get them on those. So.
Thanks. And
You have a question at the mic.
oh, thank you. I'm sorry. I cannot see the mic.
No worries.
Yeah, I know. Thank you. Okay.
Hi, my name is Cambry White. I'm actually not a genetic counselor. But I just came, my son has cystic fibrosis. He's 2. He actually has one H609R, and then he has a 2184 insertion A frame shift variant. And I just wanted to come on up here and just say thank you to the genetic counselors. I think our story, I have been so impacted by multiple genetic counselors that I've emailed with, and then our personal genetic counselor at Millard Children's, and all of the work you guys have done. It's been so meaningful. My son, we got access to Trikafta in August in a very unique way, off-label. We petitioned to the insurance company with some of the evidence in the literature. His theratyping didn't meet that 10% threshold, but did have a small bump. So he's been on it for 3 months, and we're seeing some positive results. No clinical data or anything like that, just observations, some really positive results. So I just wanted to come on here and say thank you, because it's really meaningful, and just please keep doing the work you're doing. It really has changed our family's life. So
I just have to.
I was really nervous to come up here, but I was like, I just need to say something.
So I just have to give it a shout. So Cambry is like one of the biggest advocates. She has worked with us on multiple advocacy projects. She's been so outspoken and so dedicated. Cambry's quote was on one of the slides I gave. I don't think you were. Yeah. So I gave quotes from families who had a false negative newborn screen. So Cambry is one of the quotes on there, but she has really done so much work and has been so important in a lot of the things that are already come out and are going to be coming out as well. So we just thank you for all the work you've done too. So.
You sure you want to go after that, right? Come on up.
My name is Sriram. I have one question for Dr. McGarry. So your data, you showed how there was significant challenges in diagnosing Asians in all of these data sets, right? So Zach Sellers and I had a paper where we looked at the Asian population, and we saw that we really had to disaggregate the population when you do that, you see a huge difference in how people are affected from different parts of Asia. And now when we're looking at larger databases like Nomad, and you continue to see those sort of persistent differences depending on which part of Asia, right? So how do you think that sort of disaggregation might affect how you're doing either your analysis or how we think about designing some of these panels, right? And it may or may not, but just a question or food for thought.
Yeah, and I think that's what's really hard is so race and ethnicity is just totally made up social constructs. It doesn't represent at all where you're coming from, where your family came from, or your genetic background. And so we see the Hispanic ethnic group is very heterogeneous. It is a crime to group all people who are Asian together because they come from so many diverse backgrounds, so many different locations that it can get very different variant frequency. And so the problem is the registry just says Asian, so we're really limited. In California, we are actually looking at all our missed cases. And so we have not had any variants that occur in more than one person so far that we can add on. We just went through and looked case by case at all the missed cases. And so I think it is really important, one, understanding what the populations are in your state and in your area, because there may be very unique populations that may have really unique variants that are very common within that you need to be understanding about, but also just be really thoughtful about it. There needs to be a ton more research in this area. And I think that's a huge problem. So
thank you. And the one other observation that we had was when we were looking through the US registry data set, there were some known patients at Stanford who didn't go into the Asian box because they had checked other, right? Because it's also based on people's perception of what box they should check, right?
They've gone through and so there was like a study of the registry a couple years ago that got published. So they showed when they actually compared like the race and ethnicity. And I think it was about like 4% were incorrect, but I'm not even sure if that went into enough detail. And I think that's also like the really important part for this is that the registry data should not be coming from the chart, but it should be coming from the patient, and it needs to be explained. And we probably need to switch the racial and ethnic categories to really more fit the census and really go into details. But it's another kind of project I'll be, maybe in 10 years we'll be talking about. So.
I'm also going to say, if you haven't seen Shahram's paper on this, please take a look. It's excellent. And it really goes through a lot of the details I like that it has all the numbers. So.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
I'm Karen Rary from Johns Hopkins. I think all of you know that. Just to follow up on that briefly, I want to just make a comment about a struggle that we have in CFTR2, which I think informs some of the challenges that Dr. McGarry has noted with diagnosing specifically the Asian population. So CFTR2, as I think everybody knows, gets CF registry data. And you know where it doesn't have a centralized registry? China and India, specifically, also other Asian countries. But when we think about population size, we CFTR2 are missing a huge list of variants representing the diversity in those populations specifically, as well as other Asian countries. And so that has been one of our biggest challenges, actually, is trying to figure out how do we get those patients in the registry? Now, there are people in the US from admixture that certainly represent many, many countries all around the world, Asia and otherwise. So we get those through the registry, but if you only have one report of it, then you're not seeing that on the CFTR2 website, so you don't get to include it in your analysis. So this isn't really a question, it's just a comment that this is an ongoing challenge for us. There was a big paper that came out recently-ish that lists a really long list of variants that have been identified in the Chinese population, well over 100. Only half of them have ever even been reported to CFTR2, even in one person. So it's just, it's an ongoing challenge for all of us to really increase the number of individuals of wide backgrounds that we have represented in our data set. Yeah.
I'll also go back to Hawaii. So Hawaii is like the only state that's majority Asian and Hawaiian. And Native Pacific Islander is they only test for 23 variants on their newborn screen. So you're not going to be getting any of those rare variants detected. You also don't have a CF center there as well. So that's like another population that's probably underdiagnosed. We don't understand the variants that are coming out of there as well. So I think there needs to be a lot of international collaborations, discussions. We have done sequencing. There's certain countries in Latin America that never had any genetic testing done that we've done some research projects with. So I think there's a lot of international work that needs to be done to really help understand CF as a whole.
So hi, Sameda from Green Bay, Wisconsin, genetic counselor again. This question is related to trying to not miss as many diagnoses regardless of genotype. So I know that in Wisconsin, we have a IRT cutoff of top 4th percentile, but then anybody who has IRT over 65 nanograms per mil is also then genotype. Do you know if most states have that kind of a IRT cutoff so that you don't miss those genotypes? So that would be another way to...
If you look at Clement Wren's paper in this last year, where he looked and actually surveyed all the states. And so there's nice graphs that show how many variants each state does, and then also what their IRT protocol is. And it's very variable. But do you remember how many it is? I don't remember at this point. It's not as much as needs to be. Like California, we don't have a very high IRT. And that's really the other piece of like IRT is more race and ethnically neutral way to do it. And you really do need to think about like it's the balance of how many variants plus then your IRT threshold. And you need to have a way that you are catching these kids. And I think it really is looking and constantly going back and saying, well, who did we miss? How could we have picked them up? And really thinking about like balancing it out for all the non-CF that you're going to catch with this as well.
And the CFF is doing some work to try to understand those interstate differences and try to harmonize some of this. I can tell you, I don't think that case one would be living today if not for that very high IRT category. And we're at 9:17. We could talk about this all day. I just wanted to let you know about the time. Are you okay to take one more question from Rich? Okay.
On this again, looking to the future, there's probably about a dozen pilots going on right now with primary DNA-based newborn screening. So IRT potentially could be gone in 10 years, and maybe we don't have to deal with those issues, but we're still going to have the variant interpretation issues, as I said before, as to how those are going to be called. Will it be what's on CFTR2? Will it be what ACMG says or the panel? So has there been any thought thinking forward about the day when primary sequencing is there and it's not a two-tier screen, it's a one-tier screen, and we'll be finding all the carriers and that mess?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely have heard discussions about this. I mean, the problem is still, like, we have to be able to understand what these VUSs, like, if we have so many VUSs in this population, like, what are you going to do? But I think, it's just there just needs to be so much more funding for newborn screening and, like, the Department of Public Health, because it's just such, like, the amount of contacting and, like, logistics of it, like, we just need to be in a place where, like, the United States is actually, like, really funding these programs. Because when we're on calls with the different Department of Public Health, they're in, like, despair. Like, they are across the board, blue states, red states, in a really bad place right now. And so I think when we even talk about doing small changes, they just, like, groan. So I think, I mean, like, ideally that's where we would get to, but there's so many, like, very practical barriers to that right now. So.
Thank you for a great discussion. Thanks to three really wonderful speakers and to all of you for staying with us. Enjoy the rest of the conference.